This video is going to take us through sort of some odds and ends at the end of ecology. So I'll have a lot of short, kind of separate little topics here to touch on with the remaining notes that we have. The first one is that third D of population ecology, which is demography. And demography deals with birth and death rate as much as anything. But it's just sort of a discussion of various studies of a given population. So the first thing we'll mention is what's called a life table. A life table is not anything tricky. Life tables are simply, the birth and death of a given population over the course of many years. And so this is a great time, like I put here, to bring up the statistical term cohort. Assuming you guys have heard the term cohort before. But basically, this just means, a group of individuals of the same age that you study over a given period of time. So we would look at birth and death rates of a particular cohort as they move through life. And ultimately, we don't usually see life tables in AP biology, but what we see are survivorship curves. So survivorship curves are basically a graph of a life table, where we look at either the numbers of a cohort that continue to stay alive, or we look at proportion, right? So the percentage of a cohort that continues to stay alive. And these come in three different types. So as you can see in this picture, we've got some sort of mussel or something here, and ground squirrel, and then this strange human who might be male or might be female, representing these three different types of survivorship curves. The three curves kind of depend on the behaviors of the organism. And this isn't always a perfect kind of stereotype or description, but typically true. A type 1 organism is like us. A type 1 organism will tend to survive over a much longer period of time. And so these type 1 organisms, to kind of go back to the previous notes, are organisms that often show more K-selected type behaviors, like valuing parental care, having fewer young, that sort of thing. Then, to kind of jump down here, type 3 organisms, or type 3 survivorship, is the polar opposite of what we would do, right? We see this massive, basically massive death, not long after birth. And so these type 3 would show behaviors that are more of the R-selected type, like we talked about in the previous notes. So things like having lots of offspring but not providing parental care and whatnot. And then type 2 is where just a lot of animals on our planet fall, somewhere in between, right? They don't show extensive K-selected type behavior, so they don't live quite as long as something like humans, but they also aren't quite so they're not quite so R-selected either, and so they do tend to survive a little bit longer. And then, as this points out, a lot of times survivorship curves are sort of estimates. If we were to actually plot out data for, like the example here of this ground squirrel, it's probably not going to be this perfectly straight line sort of idea, but roughly fits that type 2 survivorship that we might see in these kind of guys. Another thing about demographics is this sort of often encompasses what we call population dynamics, and the word dynamic meaning always changing, and so populations are interesting to study because they do fluctuate quite a bit, and so sort of the combination of what we saw on the last slide with survivorship, and other population studies take us to the fact that a lot of times populations are cyclical. So we see population cycles where the numbers of organisms fluctuate. They increase, they decrease, they increase, they decrease, that sort of thing. And this can depend on a lot of different limiting factors. Like it says here, oftentimes population cycles might depend upon food availability. And so then what that also indicates is that it might depend upon predators and prey. So this is a great opportunity, as you can see in this box here, to bring up one of the sort of common Gridin type questions that they like to use in AP biology when it comes to ecology. What they might show you is something similar to this population cycle graph, where you've got a predator, the lynx, and prey, this hare, overlaid upon each other. Now, this graph is good as an example of just what this is, but it's not a great example of a math-based problem. What they will often ask you to do is calculate a lag time between two different populations. So let's say we had this graph, but it was a little more spaced out. So, maybe I've got my hair line, and then the lynx line, and it's kind of more like this. Now, the way that you would estimate lag time is just a measurement between a peak for one species to the following peak of the other species, or a valley of one species to the following valley of the other species. So, for instance, if we were looking at this graph here, let's say we could measure from this peak to this peak, right? Or if we wanted to, we could measure from this peak to this peak. And that would be our lag time. So obviously we would use, whatever scale of time was at the bottom of this. But this is how we could calculate lag time. And they would space it out even better than this probably. So we might really be looking at a graph where it's something like this. You could come in then and calculate, from there to there would be your lag time calculation. And so we might see something like that kind of as we move forward. But that's all it means. Lag time is kind of the difference between population peaks of one species and population peaks of a related species. Now, demographics also often kind of refers to human population studies. That's not a rule, but I feel like oftentimes when you see demographics, they're talking about humans. So just a couple minutes to comment about human population. We actually, at this point in time, scientists still suggest that humans are showing an exponential growth model. And that's not really true of any other large animal population as a whole. There might be a small population of animals here or there where, like the previous notes mentioned, maybe it's right after a bottlenecking event or something like that, and so they show this bounce back where it's exponential. But humans as a whole, group on the planet appear to still be growing exponentially, and so we see something kind of like this graph over here, which does point out this interesting thing, which is that you had this little divot in our population because of bubonic plague, a similar divot but not nearly as deep back in 1918 to 1920 with the Spanish influenza, and some scientists have suggested a divot that will come from the coronavirus, but I kind of doubt that, really. But what's interesting is if we could zoom this graph in a little bit more and look much more closely at what's going on today, we see this point. Right, our rate of increase has slowed quite a bit since the 1960s. So while, at a glance, we're still very much like this, in reality, we're kind of starting to level. Now, that's just the very beginning of leveling, so the odds of us seeing humans meeting carrying capacity in any of your lifetimes either is really unlikely. We still have, even though we have to be careful of our resource usage and stuff, we still have a lot of space and a lot of resources that we can use. But most scientists suggest that this decreasing rate has to do with global disease. So things just in general, like AIDS and stuff. So not a very specific, like, oh, in this year there was this huge outbreak, but just an increase in disease as a whole. And then also voluntary population control. People today have fewer kids than they used to, and so that slows down the birth per capita a little bit and slows down that rate a little bit. And so that's what this graph is kind of just showing you in terms of percentage increase. That we've been going down in terms of that rate, but this does not mean that our population is going down. Our population continues to grow at a fairly exponential rate at this point in time. Now, one thing that I hope looks familiar, because we tend to cover them both in freshman biology but also in geography class, are age structure diagrams. And if you recall, age structure diagrams show us sort of a breakdown of the relative number of individuals at each age range in a population. So we see our ranges here, and then typically we are, graphing this against the percentage of the population, not an actual whole number. And these are unique because they can tell us a lot. One thing to definitely point out is don't forget that they are split into sort of a left side and right side by sex. And so if you were asked for the percentage of females here in Afghanistan, ages 0 to 4, then you would just say, that's roughly, 8.5%, right? But if you were asked for the percentage of all individuals in Afghanistan from 0 to 4, then you would have to add up your two bars. So you would say, 8.5% female, roughly 9% male, so total in this case would be like 17.5%, ages 0 to 4. Now, this can tell us a lot of different things. Most importantly, though, is how quickly a population is growing. So, for instance, this shape in Afghanistan with a really broad base and a really sharp peak is rapidly growing, versus the U.S., which does not have quite as broad of a base and still tapers some toward the top, but just not quite as much. All right, and that's versus, I believe it's Italy that'll be on the next slide, which we would say is not growing. Now, the reason you got rapid growth here, right, is most of the population is at or below reproductive age, meaning that there's a lot of potential for birth, right, in this Afghanistan age structure diagram. Humans, it still tapers toward the top, so there's still a lot of people kind of in here, right, still a lot that are at reproductive age, but it doesn't look quite as sharp, right, and it's not quite as broad down here. So we would say this is growing, but this is a little bit slower than this one on the left. Now then we've got, just to follow up with what we were saying, no growth. Notice that the top of this age structure diagram and the bottom of this age structure diagram are really similar, right? And the bulk of this population is somewhere between the ages of, 30 or 35 going up to 80. That is either out of or getting close to being out of reproductive age. So this one would be no growth or even possibly negative growth that we could see in a population like this one that we see here in Italy. Now, just some kind of data that goes with it here, shows us that industrialization has made a huge impact on human survival. Like it says here, this really depends on who you talk to, but a lot of projections published in the last few years have suggested that our world human population will be somewhere between 7.8 and 10.8 billion by the year 2050. And we still don't think that's nearing carrying capacity, really. Believe it or not, Van Leeuwenhoek, who we mentioned in freshman biology, he discovered protists, or tiny microorganisms. In 1679, he wrote that human carrying capacity would probably be somewhere around 13.4 billion. Now, where he came up with that number, I don't know, and I don't know how accurate it would be either, but assuming he's kind of right, we still have a long way to go to reach that point. But, ultimately, like I've said before, I think it makes sense that we will be limited, right? We'll be limited by resources, non-renewable resources of energy, and these are things that probably don't lead to the extinction of the human population or anything like that, but certainly lead to potentially, decrease in the human population over time and sort of a settling in a particular population size. But as I started to say just a moment ago, populations are never limitless, but our intellect, our technology, industrialization has definitely increased human carrying capacity on the planet, right? Industrialization has massively decreased infant mortality, so it's allowed us to live longer, right? And then that's reflected here too with this higher life expectancy in industrialized countries. But also just a matter of carrying capacity, you think about how many people live in a city like New York because of all the vertical growth of tall buildings and stuff. So again, there's still going to be resources that are limited, but we have, as humans, kind of figured out ways to maximize our carrying capacity when it comes to space and shelter and those sort of things as well. Now, that wraps up finally population ecology and allows us to look a little bit more at ecosystems and then wrap up with landscapes or biomes. You guys have touched on a lot of ecosystem ecology already, or will be touching on it in your independent work because it goes along with communities. And some of those things are important. So you want to be aware of what cycles are. Don't get too caught up on it, but that is a little important. You also got to be comfortable with food chains and webs just in their basic form, and this concept of energy moving through a web and energy decreasing through a web. But there are a few more things to get to, too, when it comes to kind of breaking things down in this ecosystem overarching picture. Now, I also put on here, I usually don't like when they remix videos like the Antoine Dotson video, but there's a great remix where it makes a little song out of it that might be worth checking out. So, again, take your own video break and look up Antoine Dotson remix, and you'll have a little catchy song you can listen to. And then I just thought this meme was funny because I'm a Harry Potter dork, and they changed it up a little bit there. Now, when we talk about ecosystems, they rely on producers, right? We rely on our autotrophs to absorb solar energy and convert that into a chemical form that we can actually use. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting from your book. The Earth, every day is hit with 10 to the 22nd joules, so a unit of energy, of solar radiation. And technically that amount of solar energy would be enough to meet human demands for about 25 years if we had a really efficient way to absorb it. And we don't, right? A fraction of that solar energy is absorbed by plants for photosynthesis. And what they're able to do is convert that into a certain amount of chemical energy or carbohydrates, right? And we call this our gross primary productivity, or GPP. It's like it's defined better here than I'm doing. The amount of energy from light that is converted to chemical energy in organic molecules per unit time. Now, the interesting thing is only a percentage of GPP is actually stored as organic material that then is accessible for us as consumers. And so what we often are more interested in is our net primary productivity. So sort of like, if you think back, right, remember when we did metabolism and we said, glycolysis made 4 ATP, but you had to spend 2 ATP to get it going, so your net total was 2 ATP, right? It's a similar concept here where, plants are going to harness a certain amount of GPP and production, but they're going to have to take some of that. And that's going to leave us with net primary production or productivity, which is what we can actually get energy from. So we use this formula up here. Pretty simple. Pretty sure it's on the formula sheet too. Um, that is just the net primary production. The energy that we can actually access is, you know, the gross primary production, what the plants absorb, minus autotrophic respiration. So in other words, the plants are going to use some of that energy, and then we can get what's left. And generally, this is about half of GPP. Now, don't get too worried about this, but this would be the units we use, right? Joules per meter squared year. But don't worry about that at all. And what we just want to remember is that the big key is whatever the plants can absorb, we have access to about half of that for our energy usage. And then just as a side point, you guys remember this stuff from photosynthesis, but productivity is affected by really two big limiting factors, and that's light and that's necessary nutrients, right? Things like water and other compounds that are used in photosynthesis. Also, just as a reminder from when we did that stuff, CO2, not really a limiting factor. There's so much in our environment that plants can absorb that we don't usually consider that a limiting factor. Now, sort of another term for this, right, is secondary production. So secondary production is the amount of chemical energy in consumers' food that is converted into their own new biomass. So when a plant does primary production, we have to consider, that's GPP, and then that gets whittled down into NPP, which is what we have access to. And then what actually gets incorporated into a consumer is called secondary production. Now, all of this stuff we're talking about is an example of trophic efficiency, right? How well does the energy that starts in the sun make its way from one trophic level to the next? And this gives us what you might recall from freshman year, which were pyramids, right? Energy pyramids. Another way of expressing a food chain, basically. And so if you remember those, you might also remember that we had what we called the 10% rule. And this is the idea that from one trophic level to the next, right, primary producer to primary consumer, then to secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and so on, you are going to only pass about 10% of the energy onto the next group. And so think about that carefully, right? A lot of times people get moving too fast here, I think, and they think, okay, so I lose 10%. No, it's not that, right? You actually lose 90% of energy from one trophic level to the next. So trophic efficiency is not very efficient, right? But this 10% rule too realizes a very big generalization. This is ideal, and a lot of times the amount of trophic efficiency from one level to the next is highly variable depending on the situation at hand. But for our purposes, just in general, you want to think of it as only about 10% of energy goes from one trophic level to the next. Now, this gives us a second Gridin type question that we very often see. In fact, we see it so frequently that I put one of these on that sort of, right before Christmas, we did that practice exam, and I put one of these on there. And I think I mentioned then when we talked about it that I thought you all could handle it, even though you hadn't seen something like it before. And what it has to do with is trophic efficiency and the laws of thermodynamics, right? So remember that most importantly, the first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but that energy changes forms. So energy changes forms, no creation or destruction. So this gives rise to these flowcharts. Now they might look a little bit different than this, but a lot of times in the Gridin section, or as part of a free response, they like to throw in something like this. And what they're seeing is, if you remember that energy is always conserved, which is the other term for the first law of thermodynamics, right? It's called the law of conservation of energy. So when you look at some kind of flow chart like this, you just have to remember that the ins have to equal the outs, right? So then you just follow the arrows. So let's say you have this question and they're asking us how much energy is used in respiration by these primary consumers, right? Well, I've got 125 grams per meter squared that came in, right? And then notice that I've got 60 grams per meter squared that goes to the soil. So this is probably like waste, right? Feces, whatever. And I've got 5 grams per meter squared that go on to secondary consumers. So just a fraction of it that would go on to that next trophic level. And then it wants to know what respiration would be. All right, so if I set up a little formula like this, then I just have some algebra to do, right? And I can see that x equals 60. All right, so this is a really typical type of grid-in thing that we might see, so you want to make sure that you're comfortable with that. Now, last thing, and I promise it's brief, is looking at biomes, or oftentimes now referred to as landscapes. Biomes, as I think we mentioned at the very start of this PowerPoint, are similar ecosystems across the globe. So something like a desert that might be found on different continents, but would be a similar type of ecosystem. And essentially, landscapes or biomes are determined by their climate and their type of vegetation. So just to remind you from freshman year real quick, climate is temperature and precipitation, right? And climate is really a function of latitude. Your temperature in particular is going to be affected by the intensity of sunlight that you have. And so the closer you are to the equator, the warmer your climate will be. We also talked freshman year about the greenhouse effect, which is the trapping of heat energy closer to the planet. But this also is reliant on sun intensity, which is reliant on latitude. And so one thing that we see sometimes to compare climates is called a climograph, not to be confused with the climatograph, which we actually have to learn in freshman year. But a climograph, it looks a little bit like this next page. So here is a climograph shown to you in a way, though, that is specific to biomes. So this is one way this can look up here, which is kind of cool. You kind of get these weird amorphous shapes on here, but what they're showing you is, what is the temperature and precipitation, or in other words, what is the climate we would expect for, say, a desert. And so they're going to show you then that is in any kind of range right there. Or what is the climate range for tundra? Well, it would be anything that falls in this range of temperature, right, and this range of precipitation. Now then we've got a different kind of climograph, which is sort of a international map of this, where they show you the various landscapes or biomes and where they fall on the various continents. So as you can see, where we live, we're sort of on the border here of a temperate broadleaf forest and a temperate grassland, but certainly temperate based on our latitude. Not real hot, not real cold, have true differing seasons where we live. Now, when we talk about the biomes or the landscapes that are out there, there are different sources are going to tell you different things, but we basically break them into two groups, which are the terrestrial biomes or land biomes and the aquatic biomes. Terrestrial, we usually consider 8 or 9 different possibilities which would include, the temperate grassland, temperate forest, like we're talking about for us, along with deserts and tundras and coniferous forests, so like evergreens, tropical rainforests, that kind of stuff. Um, Again, these are named primarily by their climate and their vegetation. So a temperate grassland, as you might guess, is temperate in climate, kind of in the middle, right? And grasslands. So we're going to see a lot of low-lying vegetation and that sort of thing. Species composition, again, differs from biome to biome, so that means the animals there as well. And then a term that we see a lot, I think it is part of the independent work too, is disturbance, right? Disturbance means something that affects one species is probably going to affect all of the species in a given ecosystem, and therefore in a given biome or landscape. So disturbance kind of maintains biomes, but it also kind of helps them to develop in a particular way. And again, this might be an effect of natural disasters and things like that. Climatic events, or a lot of times can involve human activity as well. Don't have to know much about terrestrial biomes, but what you do want to know is that they're layered vertically. So again, this is not something that you're going to be tested hard on, I don't think, from me or the actual AP people. But when we look at a terrestrial biome, we look at it vertically, right? So you've got a root layer that's below ground. Then you've got what's called this litter layer, which is kind of right on the forest floor. And again, this is an example of some kind of forest here. You'd have a ground layer of herbaceous plants, so very short plants. Then you have what's called an understory, which is mostly like shrubs. You've got a low tree layer, and then you've got a canopy, which would be all the way at the top, right? And so we talk about, these vertical layers that you can find within a biome. And as a biome or an ecosystem develops, we add layers, right? So an early thing would just be grasses and very low-lying plants, and then eventually you get these big, tall trees that produce this canopy. Probably more important on this slide is this vocab term, ecotone. We have seen this in multiple choice a few times. An ecotone is sort of an area between biomes. So again, these things don't just stop and start, right? It's not like, oh wow, this temperate grassland just ends at this certain line, and then it's a forest from there. So in some ways, we are kind of in an ecotone between grasslands and broadleaf forests, and that's why where we live, you can see a lot of open plains, but you can also see a lot of wooded areas. But this is this kind of gray area as one biome becomes another. Last thing then are the aquatic biomes. Aquatic biomes are described much more on just their physical sort of appearance or their physical feature, and less on the climate, because the climate can range quite a bit on these things. When we talk about aquatic biomes, we're talking about something like a lake versus a river, versus a couple things you're probably not as familiar with, like estuaries, which is a transitional area between the river and the ocean. Intertidal zones, which is like a beach, so to speak, where it's sometimes covered in water and sometimes not. The pelagic zone, which is basically the ocean. Coral reefs, right? Things like that. So aquatic biomes, a little different setup. We've got what are called marine biomes, which would be saltwater, right? And then we've got freshwater biomes. So you got something like the ocean versus most lakes, streams, that sort of thing are freshwater. And aquatic biomes are not so much vertically layered as they are just broken up into zones. So let's look at one more slide that shows you some aquatic zones that we look at. So the pelagic zone, and I've heard that said a couple different ways before, but the pelagic zone is sort of like the open body of water, right? And when we look at this open body of water, the pelagic zone here is broken into two different things, the photic zone and the aphotic zone. Now, photo prefix means light. So the photic zone means that there is light penetration. So we do see a lot of photosynthesis or a lot of production, right, in that photic zone. And then the aphotic zone, below that, we see less light penetration. Now this line between the two, right, the photic and aphotic zone can vary a little bit seasonally. In the summer, you're going to have more, stronger sunlight, and so the photic zone might be a little bigger and go a little bit deeper than the aphotic zone would. But yeah, you're probably going to see less production, or you are going to see less production or productivity in the aphotic zone because you can't really have photosynthesis so much. Now the abyssal zone, right, or the abyss, is going to be found at the very lowest part of the pelagic zone, or the very lowest part of the aphotic zone. There's still life here, right? But there's not really going to be photosynthetic organisms, and so there's not nearly as much production as we get away from that light. The benthic zone will be a little bit more confusing. Notice these arrows here. The benthic zone is like the floor, right? But it's a recognition that this doesn't have to mean deep, right? Like abyssal, that means deep. But the benthic zone doesn't necessarily mean deep. This could mean deep or shallow, but it means the floor of the aquatic biome. So this is going to involve sand, organic, inorganic settlements. It's sediment, excuse me. So it's basically like your soil of the ocean or lake or whatever we're looking at. And then the last thing to point out here is just another new vocab word, which is thermocline. Hopefully you'd see thermo and you'd think something to do with temperature, but thermocline is like an abrupt change between the upper and lower areas. So there's a very distinct thermocline at this line between the photic and aphotic zone, because where the light penetrates, it's going to be warmer versus where the light does not penetrate. And every once in a while, if you've ever been, I'm not a huge fan, but if you've ever been out in the water at a beach or something, you might even feel that. You'll feel the undertow or something down by your ankles will feel much colder all of a sudden. And what that's doing is that's bringing in water from the aphotic zone that's much cooler and kind of running it underneath that surface water. And so that's why you might feel that thermocline very distinctly, like, wow, the water at my knees right now is cold, but the water above that is warm. Okay, so I know it's a lot, but that takes care of all of our ecology notes, which again is really not a huge unit compared to some of the ones that we have done this year. So thank you for listening along.